Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for part two of our two-part series on one Place Studies. And I'm delighted today to welcome as our very special guest, Janet Barrie, who is the chair of the Society for One Place Studies in the UK, and joins me in this worldwide ambition of helping people understand the larger opportunity to be gained from one place studies as a focus and a way to look at it. So all of us who are studying our family history can be looking at things in the context of one place, one ship, one community, one house. Looking at that kind of focus takes a different view of it. And that's where we're going to start. So today's program is part two, in that Janet Barrie has been following the rigor and structure defined by Janet Few in her book. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Janet and let her pick it up from there. Go ahead, please, Janet.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for the welcome. I'm going to issue an apology at the beginning. I'm getting over a chest infection and I'm still spluttering from time to time. So if I go on mute, cough and splutter, just bear with me, please, for a few seconds. And then when I can breathe again, I'll come and join you. Hopefully that won't be too big a burden. And I'll share my screen if that's okay. So. Okay, so hopefully you should be able to see a slide on a green background saying Beyond the Basics, Advancing Your One Place Study. And as Barbara indicated, this is part two of a two-part series looking at conducting a one-place study in the context of our family history. And as she also said, it follows this book from Janet Few's, 10 Steps to a One-Place Study. I'll go back one. There we go. As one placers, we only have two rules. One is that you research with integrity. We want to be honest and have integrity in our dealings, in our studies, in the people whom we're researching, the people that we're researching with. And also have fun. This is a hobby. It can get crazily addictive, but it can be great, great fun. And there's two books demonstrated on there. Janet's actual second book, 10 Steps to a One Place Study, on which this talk is based with her kind permission. But she's also recently issued volume 2 of Putting Your Ancestors in Their Place. Volume 1 was jammed full of ideas for projects and areas you could take your one place study, but had a very England and Wales focus. Volume 2 is a lot more global and generally applicable in its scope. They're both available on Kindle, and if you're interested in this, I would strongly encourage you to get, well, both of them. She doesn't pay me for this. Okay, so these are Janet's 10 steps, and last time we looked at the first 5. We looked at how you choose your place and discussed how a place can be anything that has a geographical boundary. So it can be a village, it can be a street, it can be a house, it can be a war memorial, it can be a cemetery, it can be a ship. We do have a ship, even a sunken ship. And then also, what is a study? And the beauty of a one-place study is it can go in any direction you want it to. So it's driven by the interests and the skill of the researcher, the nature of the place and the community, and we'll come back to that, and also the resources that are available and the opportunities that you have to access and deal with them. We also looked at how you reconstruct your place, how you work out who lived there, how you gathered the data, and how you began to make connections between them. And I think I'm correct, Barbara, that this is still available. So those who didn't see it last time, if you want to go and take a look, then please do, it's there. So for the next hour or so, 40 minutes, we're going to look at what you do with all this lovely data that you've accumulated. It's not just to sit in a spreadsheet or a file under the bottom of the bookcase. What conclusions can we draw from it? How do we analyse it? How can we put it together? What story does it tell about the lives of the people that lived in that place at a time when certain things were happening? and where can we go with all this? And then later on in the last two, how we spread the word and how we enthuse others. And I freely admit that's where I'm less skilled. So I'm also looking forward to learning from you guys here too. So analysing and synthesising. Janet separates them in her 10 steps, probably so she can get to 10 of them. But in practice, you normally do them together. You take your data, you pull it apart, you analyse it, you put it back together, you see how it sits, you realise it may go differently, you pull it apart again, you put it back together a different way, you go and find some other data. Do we need to revise our conclusions in the light of that? So it's a kind of swinging one to the other. So we're going to look at some examples and suggest some ideas for working with incomplete data, because I don't know about your family history, but mine is nowhere near as complete as I'd like it to be. And if anybody knows who my great-great-grandfather was, please let me know. And looking at different tools for analysing this data as well. Okay, so we're going to start with a couple of worked examples. And I want to take you back to 1841, and I want to introduce you to a lady called Mary Ashworth. So Mary was the servant of John Ashworth, who lived in that house at the back there with the six chimney stacks, and his wife Betty and his spinster daughter Mary Ann. So there were two Mary Ashworths in that house. John was a colliery proprietor, and he had capitalised on the Industrial Revolution. As the Industrial Revolution came out, the spinning jenny, the spinning mule, the steam engine, he didn't set up a cotton mill. He realised that the poor quality, thin veins of coal in the local hills were suddenly worth mining, because until the railways came in, the only way you could get the coal to the mill was in a horse and cart. And so he started to mine what until then was pretty unprofitable veins of coal in the hills, and started to make good money out of it, and began to employ a couple of servants. And so Mary the servant, as opposed to Mary the daughter, was one of these. She was born, we know from the 1841 census that she was born in the county. Her age was given as 30, and that she was single. She was still there in 1851. By this time, John and Betty had both died, and so there were two Mary Ashworths in the house. Mary, the daughter of John and Betty Ashworth, and Mary, their long-time servant. And this census tells us that she was actually born in 1811, so 30 in 1841 was accurate, and that she was born in the local parish. Okay, so we're beginning to fill out in a pretty standard way something about who she is. Now, I don't know if you have this kind of problem in your ancestry or your one place studies research. That is a screenshot of the baptisms rather, for an Ashworth in Newchurch St Nicholas between 1809 and 1812. And as you can see, there are quite a few Mary Ashworths to choose from. Looking for an Ashworth in Rosendale, you just look under a stone and there's half a dozen of them, and how to put them all together in the correct families. So it's not short of Ashworths, and that's before we look at the Methodists, the Baptists, the Unitarians, the Quakers. So as we start marrying and burying some of these off to try and find the right Mary, we can take a wider look. And how typical is Mary the servant and her experience of the experience of servants in my place in the 1840s and 1850s. So, looking at the wider picture from the 1851 census, I can see that there are 15 servants in the immediate area. The majority of these are female, and the majority of the servants were females, and the majority of the number of servants were nearly 12% of all the employed females, and that includes the ones in the textile mills and all the rest of it. So female servants was quite a common source of employment for women in the area in 1840s and 1850s. 1 in 10 of all employed females was a servant, slightly more. Male servants, as a percentage of all the males with a job, was much, much lower. Okay. And that's a graph of how old they are. It's just a pie chart of their ages from the 1841 census. Shows, sadly, that one of them was very, very young. And then they peak in teens, early 20s. A few go up to 30, but they're beginning to marry off by then. And then very few longer than that. So Mary, the servant, was 30 in 1841. So she's here on this graph, just between the two shades of green. But she remains a single servant 10 years later. So in that sense, she was atypical. Okay, so who is employing servants? And those are the occupations of the people who are employing female servants in 1841. And interestingly, they're mainly farmers and woolen weavers, and then a small smattering of other people, not all necessarily very rich. You don't necessarily think of the shopkeeper or the innkeeper as being particularly rich. They may be doing all right for themselves, but you don't really think of them as being particularly rich. Only the schoolmaster had 2 servants, a male and a female, so the normal pattern was to only have one. And all of them were born in the county. There is no evidence at this stage of people coming into Lancashire from elsewhere to work in service. Okay, so you look a little bit more widely. That's in the immediate Spring Hill area, the actual small community that comprises my one place study. If you look in the wider township, I can see that they've taken the 4 sample occupations and tracked who employs servants on the census of the wider township. That suggests that although there are people, that slide indicates there are people perhaps of relatively lowly means who are employing servants, that servant employment was by no means the norm or universal. So, for example, the vast majority of manufacturers, and the perception in Lancashire where I am, is that the mill owners were rich and all had tons of money and tons of servants. Well, that's not necessarily true in the 1840s. The surgeon looked to be doing all right, and the clergy were doing well. And it suggests that you're better off being a Methodist minister, 2 of who had servants, or an Anglican Church of England minister, as opposed to the Baptist who managed without. So maybe the Baptist congregation didn't pay enough, I'm not sure. Where did these servants come from? How did they get their jobs and how did they get their roles? There's a journal called The Patriot, which a newspaper aimed largely at the dissenting congregations, the nonconformists. And he was upfront about being a dissenting family, an employee from a dissenting faith, and he wanted a servant of decided piety. A similar advert, a man advertised for a position of his servant, and he specified in the advert that he would like to work for an employer who would respect his wishes not to work on the Sabbath. I would love to know whether he got a job under those terms and conditions or not, but that was his preference. They are not actually from my study. These are from the wider, from England as a whole. And I have no evidence locally in the township of people specifying dissenters as servants, as either employers or employees. But there's plenty of nonconformity in the area, so that wouldn't necessarily be surprising. Equally, a man in Cambridge, this was a man in Cambridge, but actually Cambridge Chronicle, Cambridge newspaper, but actually advertising for a job in North Wales. He wanted a man and wife without encumbrance. The man would be employed as a farm labourer and the woman to assist as a servant must be able to cook and make herself generally useful. And I can't help wondering there, by specifying a man and wife, whether he wanted 2 servants but was only prepared to pay 1 wage. But he was a bit more specific, no dissenter need apply. So he was not having a nonconformist. And there was plenty of advice for housemaids in the mid 19th century. One that, excuse me, pardon me. There would be no shortage of advice in booklets like this one that could be distributed towards servants that helped them best as to do their jobs. 6p sewed, or 5 shillings per dozen to give away. Now, I would love to know who was going to have a dozen servants to give this book for, or whether people gathered together to put them throughout their community. Excuse me a minute.
While Janet takes a minute to you okay?
Yeah, I can't find the mute button when I'm on screen.
No, not at all. It's perfectly fine. You take your time. I know I had to go look up for poorly educated Americans. I had to go look up non-conforming. So it sort of means something different around here.
All right, okay.
No, that's okay. Those who did not adhere to the Church of England, is that basically the idea?
Yeah.
And similarly dissenting?
Yes.
Very interesting. All right.
Yeah. So,
okay.
So you would have, quick thing on nonconformity, when you had the Reformation, the English Reformation in the 15th, 16th, 16th, 17th centuries, you would have groups of people for whom that didn't go far enough. The Quakers came out of that, and various independent congregations, the Baptists, later on the Methodists, the Unitarians, not the Catholics, they were treated separately.
I think it's also relevant for many Americans because many of our ancestors who came over in these waves from England were in these varying dissenting categories. And the best way to dissent was, as my Chinese husband likes to remind me, these were that wasn't good enough. They had to take it just a level higher.
Yeah.
Says something about a lot of the Yankee areas.
The Church of England is a very broad church, actually, and accepts a wide range of both belief and practices. As people got more particular, they got more exclusive, and the denominations became smaller and smaller and more focused. And for reasons that I could bore you with and won't at the moment, there are a lot of these nonconformist communities around in my local area. And why is absolutely fascinating because we're in the middle of nowhere. But there you go.
That'll be a topic for another conversation then.
Happy to, if people think it's interesting, sure. Anyway, so you could buy these manuals for best methods to perform the duties of a housemaid, and I would love to know who had a dozen to give them away to, but hey. I'm not quite sure how reliable this advice is. I'll just give you a minute to read it. But I'm not sure that trundling your mop to splash respectable passers-by was quite the best way of showing your skill and dexterity. But the Manchester Courier and Lancashire General Advertiser in 1843 seemed to think that that was okay. So, that will make them feel what a handy wench you are. You are doing nothing but your business, a great value in a servant. And then you could take this further by comparing the pattern of servant employment in 1840s, 1850s, which is what we've looked at now, and then look at it again, say in 1881, and look at it again in, say, 1911, and how this has changed over the time. Are there more or fewer servants? Are they concentrated in big households, or is servant employment still widely generalised? Are they still all local girls, or is there a tendency for the local girls to go into the mill where the money is better, and girls from outside the local area coming in to take domestic posts? in which case do they marry local men and stay there, or do they move on and get positions elsewhere? What happens to them? So just starting with one woman in one household can lead to a whole range of things that you can consider depending on your interest and the availability of the records. And you can take that in any number of directions. I'm sure, for example, in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, there was a degree of upper class one-upmanship in the size of your household, and I've got more servants than you have, sort of thing. So we will leave the servants and let's go and have a look at Crosswaite and look at parish registers. Now, Crosswaite is a large parish in the north of Cumbria, northwest of Cumbria. It's kind of a bit difficult on this map. It's kind of there, as you can see that. But the purple bit is Scotland, and that gives you some idea of where you are. Okay. And that dates back to Saxon times, the church there. It's possibly even Roman, so it's long-standing. But it's hill country. It's the English Lake District, if you know of that part of the world. Nothing grows there. It supports a few sheep. So it was very, very sparsely populated in the 16th and 17th century. So what can we learn by looking at parish registers? So some examples, we can reconstruct the families. We can see if there's any indication of the ages, the status, the residence patterns. We can look at how women were documented. But also, we can start counting the broad numbers and look at overall about the patterns of baptisms, marriages, and burials. Whether there's gaps between birth and baptism varied, whether there's gaps between marriage and first baptism also varied, whether there are patterns that people got married at certain times of year and whether the births corresponded with that, whether people tried to die at certain times of year. The parish registers would record baptisms, marriages, and burials. They date back to 1538, although few survive from that time, and they are officially standardised. But anybody who's looked at British parish registers know that they vary widely in both completeness and legibility. But there's two local historians called Wrigley and Schofield who went through the parish registers for 400 English parishes, and they published aggregate data of the total numbers of baptisms, marriages, and burials in each of these parishes for each month. So it's a huge piece of work. And they from that, they discerned quite a lot of trends of when people were marrying, when they were hatching, matching, and dispatching. They published that not at all thin book of bedtime reading, but they also very kindly made their data set available for the individual parishes by parish. And unfortunately, the one for my area wasn't one of the ones that was transcribed from in which my one place study is, but Crosswaite in the Cumbria was. So those of you this graph shows the number of baptisms, which are the orange ones, the number of marriages, which are the yellow ones at the bottom, and the number of burials, which are the green ones, usually in between. It gives both the raw data and it gives a 5-year moving average. So each year you add on the next year, drop the last year, recalculate the average and plot that, add on the next year, drop the last year. So taking the burials, for example, you can see these obvious peaks. There's one there in 1596, there's one there in 1603. And even though the moving average smooths it out a bit, you can still see there's something going on in those times. So what is it? Now, obviously, it's a lot harder to find about individuals. And whatever it was, in 1593, it was killing men. Yeah. There's a peak in burials killing women. There's a peak in burials of males, the blue line. There's a lot more females that were dying. So it's killing women, whatever it is. So any ideas as to what it might have been? What might have been going on?
Something related to childbirth?
Could be, couldn't it? Yeah. But it's unusual to get something related to childbirth that
Well, practices, for example, and not a clear understanding of how bacteria move and childbirth practices would, I don't know.
yeah. It was, oh, sorry, I'm going backwards. It was actually a combination of famine and plague. And why it was killing the women more than the men is not really known. But it wiped out entire villages and oops, I can't move on. I'm not quite sure what's happened there. Oops, sorry, there we go. So that is one village of probably 4 or 5 farmsteads in a particular area. Or rather, that is the entries in the parish register for Crosswaite for August and September 1598. And Keskadale is one particular village of about 3 or 4 farmsteads. And you can see it's just wiped out the whole lot of them. You know, the Towson family have gone, the Thwaite family have gone, the Walker family are going. And it's just devastated entire communities. And it was a combination of things. The Revelation in the Bible talks about the 4 horsemen, war, climate, famine, and death. And it must have felt like that at the time. There wasn't much war going on. There were episodes of bad climate that led to poor crops. There was a combination of famine that led to people being weakened generally. And then there was an outbreak of the plague that just carried a load off. And I suspect you're right, Barbara. I suspect that childbirth, in terms of the frequency of pregnancies and the lack of recovery between pregnancies and the stresses of childbirth and child rearing, probably contributed to its disproportionate impact on females. Now, if statistics and working at a population at a macro level is one of the things that interests you, there is years worth of interesting stuff in there and lots of questions that you can ask as to what's going on. So I'll take another example now, and I'd like you to meet Adam Bridge. Now, Adam, as far as I'm aware, is not a direct ancestor. He is a resident of my study place, and he died in 1664. And this is the inventory to his will. And his will very helpfully names his 5 children, including who the females are married to. So thank you very much, Adam. I wish others had done that. So we're used perhaps to dealing with Victorian documents, and early modern ones are less complete and a bit more vague. So we need to gather information from different sources to produce a fuller picture. So what can we learn about life in our place from these? Well, from one inventory, not an awful lot. He had a bed, he had bed linen, he had a set of fire tongs, and so on and so forth. So what? But put them together with other documents and a picture begins to emerge. So you can look at other inventories from the area. Is his holding typical or not of that of other people who died and left wills, itself a subset of the population, of course, at that time in this area? Or was he on the rich end? Was he on the poor end? But you can also compare it to entries from the court records, the manorial court records. And this is Hurst Lane, just behind the house where Adam Bridge lived. It is still technically a road, although I wouldn't like to drive over it. And Adam's brother Jordan was repeatedly fined for failing to maintain the highway behind his house, which was that. And I don't think it takes a vast amount of imagination to think what that road must have been like for carts in the 17th century, because it probably wasn't vastly different to how it looks like on there. And I didn't say it is technically a road, but I wouldn't really like to drive anything over it. So you can add this to other fines that Jordan and his brothers had. They were fined for failing to maintain fences so that their animals got out and ate other people's grass. They were fined for trespassing with beasts. They were fined for failing to maintain rights of way. They were fined for blocking rights of way. And you begin to get a picture of little petty squabbles between neighbours. Perhaps a bit like we have today sometimes, maybe with who has to maintain the fence, or whose responsibility is it to mow the lawn. But it also shows about the importance of moving animals between summer and winter pasture, and the way that people and animals moved, and the consequences that happened to a community when you couldn't do that. You can see from that the land isn't great quality. It will support a few cows, but not a vast amount else. And I like to think of it as somebody blocking the drive to blocking your drive with their car when you have to get to work. If you can't get your animals to where they need to be, then it's difficult to feed them appropriately, and they won't do as well. But then that gives a context into which more serious neighbourhood disputes can be considered. And this is an example of the testimony of a bad character of James Pilling. And if you look closely at the bottom, there's 3 people signed this testimonial: Thomas Saunders, Jane Pickup, and our friend Adam Bridge. He pops up again there. He's one of the church wardens. And James Pilling has a reputation for stealing looms, stealing horses, putting horses in another man's grass, and occupying another man's house without permission. In short, is a grabbling, quarrelsome fellow. And you can imagine not wanting to live next door to this chap, and the community trying to come together to do something about this general nuisance that James Pilling is causing. And he is obviously a level beyond Jordan Bridge and failing to maintain his beasts, because this kind of document appears not to survive for him. Excuse me a minute. Thank you. And then it gets worse, and this is Francis Bridge, almost certainly a relation, but I haven't worked out how. And he marries a local girl, and he has 2 children. And he deserts his wife about 8 weeks before the second baby is born. And he leaves her reliant on the charity of friends and family for to survive. So the child is born, and the child is exposed, basically left on the hill to be either found or die. The child was found and brought to the overseers of the poor, and they are seeking permission to pursue Francis Bridge to get him to cough up for his misdemeanors. And again, it gives some example of the strain that this kind of situation has on a local community at that time, and the way the community got together to deal with it, and how to handle it. And people being abandoned is not in Labour is not a common event, but it does happen. And this is one example of how that was handled. And this is actually a 2-page petition to the Justices of the Peace. This is page 1. And page 2 includes the signatories, which includes our friend Adam Bridge again. So we know next to nothing about Adam apart from what he left in his will and who he left it to. But we're beginning to get a picture of him as a church warden and general upright fellow, being dragged into solving local disputes, many of which almost certainly included his family members. Some of them certainly included his brother. And I haven't yet linked all the bridges together, because I need another lifetime, basically. But there's again plenty of areas to explore and develop that if that is an area of interest. And on a cheerier note, this is a document licensing the house of Abraham Howarth for dissenting worship. Howarth was almost certainly a Quaker, and you can see that it's signed by our friend Adam Bridge again. And he's popping up a few times in this context. So it wasn't all failing to maintain your highway and abandoning your wife. And there's signs of the community coming together, wanting to establish worship in a way that wasn't in accordance with the Church of England. He'll say he was almost certainly a Quaker, and seeking permission from the authorities to be able to do that so that they can do it unmolested. And this was about 1672. Okay. So, as family historians, you know about record linkage and the sort of things that you can pull together to form a fuller picture of your ancestors. That's some of them. And just starting with a will, it takes you into some of the areas that you might want to draw upon in order to fill out the picture. You can do it at an individual level, you can do it at a series of individual levels, or you can do it at a community level. And you can do that for other groups of sources and put them together and form your fuller picture. Nice long posh word, but prosopography is a historical technique that will investigate the common characteristics of a group of people when you actually know very little about any of them as individuals. So I can't put together an individual biography of Adam Bridge. I can't put together an individual biography of James Pilling. I can't put together an individual biography of Jordan Bridge or Francis Bridge or any of these other 17th century characters. What I can do is draw the snippets together from each of them and form an overall impression for what life would be like in that community, even if I don't particularly know what any one individual did within it, apart from perhaps the odd will or appearance in court records or church records or what have you. So in order to do that, you need to have something in common between the subjects that you're studying. And one example from English history is a group of medieval historians have put together a database of every Anglo-Saxon in England whose name they know from the surviving records. And it's a fantastic piece of work, and if you're interested in Anglo-Saxon history, go to that. There's another one on clergy of the Church of England in the 16th, 17th century that draws together snippets of information from different sources to put together what they can about the lives of clergymen at that stage. So we've talked about synthesizing and analyzing and given some examples of 3 different ways of doing that from very different starting points and using very different techniques to ask different questions of our information. But what was going on in the wider world at the time that this was happening? So Mary Ashworth, we're talking roughly 1840s, 1850s. So you've got the Factory Acts around about that time. We were beginning to limit the number of hours that people could work in the mills, particularly women and children, to some extent also men. Pardon me. You've also later got provisions for compulsory elementary education and the Boer War, the Crimean War, and also for married women being able to hold property in their own right, which at that time they couldn't. The ones that we're looking at in the 1600s, 1660s, we've got the ongoing Reformation, which, as we said, led to the rise in not just the Church of England as opposed to the Roman Catholic Church, but a whole shed load of smaller denominations as well. The famine at Crosswaite that we looked at earlier was part of a wider famine and plague in England at the time that was part had a huge impact on the country and was part of bringing in the Poor Law Relief Act and the Tillage Act, which was to do with access to common resources. Later on, you've got the aftermath of the Civil War, a set of acts of 1662 that said you had to take communion in the Church of England, which was widely ignored and repealed 10 years later. You've got the poll taxes and the hearth taxes. And you can take the hearth taxes and you can work out how many houses in a particular area had got how many hearths. Were they put together in clusters, so were they rich and poor areas, or were they scattered throughout a community and it was a bit more egalitarian? And you can begin to look at what we've found out about our places and put them into the context of what was going on in the world at the time. I presume for you guys in the US, the Eastern US, would the Civil War be one of the factors that you might want to look at what was happening? Or if you were, if it was land that it was explored relatively late, who was there beforehand? Anybody? Or was it just moose? And if there were people there, what happened to them and how were they using it? Okay, so, and then the last two are sharing your findings and enthusing others. And again, I'd like to chuck it open at this point, if that's all right. I have a website where a lot of my information goes. I'm reasonably active on Blue Sky, less so on other areas of social media. I pop up at meeting. I'm horrendously oversubscribed to society, so I pop up at various meetings and share information, discussions, pick brains, shamelessly steal ideas from the people that go there and network in that sense. But I'm aware that there's a vast range of tools and opportunities out there for sharing our findings and enthusing others. I was wondering which ones other people have found useful. So please, with Barbara's permission, either pop something in the chat or unmute yourself and just say what works for you, and maybe we can learn from each other in that side as well.
Why don't we go ahead and take the slides down so we can see each other a little better. And everybody, please feel free to turn on your camera if you'd like, and unmute yourselves and join in the conversation. I know it's exciting out here in the former colonies. And I think I'm looking at our audience here reflecting Australia and Canada, as well as I've learned a lot about Australian, Canadian, New Zealand, and other parts of the extended former empire, and learned a lot about where we come from, and more, to me, it's why we came.
And that's also great because there's people from my place that ended up in US, Canada, New Zealand. So not only why did they go, but where did they go? What did they find when they got there? And why did they stay? Some stayed, some came back.
Yeah.
The interrelatedness of it is one of the many fascinating things for me.
Exactly. That's what I'm so excited about in terms of what we're doing here, what I'm responsible for in building a community is discovering this cross feeds as we learn from each other. Please join in.
Great things as a one-place study is that I can nick individuals and events that aren't from my direct ancestry. Mine were all God-fearing Baptist cotton weavers. I've not found a black sheep yet, apart from one illegitimate. So, so I can pinch other people's interesting studies and go and research those. And
yeah, that's actually one of the things that really struck me from your description. So please join in. Yeah, Jennifer, please. You went off mute. Come on in.
Just getting my thoughts. What you just said then, Janet, about my family's similar. They're just ordinary working. They were ordinary working people, rarely in the newspapers or did anything very newsworthy to get excited about. good people, but people who just worked hard, you know. And I love that about doing a one place study, that you can go off on all these little tangents with people who are doing, you know, who did weird and wonderful things that people in my family would never have done, you know. And I also am really passionate about finding out why they left where they were, you know, and that was mainly why I started my one place study. I haven't found that out yet, but in looking for that, you come across all sorts of, you know, fantastic things to follow up. And so, yeah, but I don't probably share, you're talking about sharing. I probably don't share around as much as I should. I do a little bit. I'll do a bit on Blue Sky, but I'm a bit hit and miss. I might do it every day for a week, and then I mightn't do it for a fortnight. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the sharing, one of the things I'm happy about in this environment is that you can focus on your work and
Yeah.
share your work and keep going. You don't, there's,
Yeah.
I don't know, the whole social media posting of things for a purpose feels sometimes can feel pretty uncomfortable and inconsistent with what you're trying to do, as opposed to conversations with other people who are interested in the same thing. So from my perspective of building a community is trying to bring more people in who share an interest. And I think that point about sharing the experience of colonists, of people who gave up everything to get on a boat and go to an unknown place on somebody else's promise. Wow.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. You'd love to know, wouldn't you? Wish they had have written down what was in their minds at the time.
I started from a challenge of one of my cousins is saying, well, when did our people get here? And you know what? Certainly for Americans, I suspect that for all of us from colonies, always have that's one obvious itch. When did we get here? As if it's some kind of one-upsmanship of how early. You know, they did. So who got here and why did they leave? To me is the real question. But anyway, and then there were a lot. And when did they get here? Why did they leave? And you've just given me great ideas, Janet, I've been so focused on the getting here and not paying enough attention to what I already know about where they came from, and then diving into those parish records from that place and not getting hung up on finding my guy, just study that place.
Quite a lot of people start a study either because they have a brick wall and so they just gather information as much as they can about the community he was in the hope eventually of being able to break down the brick wall, or they realize that they're related to so many in that place that they've pretty much done it anyway, and kind of filling in the gaps. As a more recent aside, my aunt joked that before she was married, she was related to half the congregation of the local Baptist church, and that after she was married, she'd married into the other half, and it's actually true. Did somebody have a hand? Linda, I think you had your hand up.
I think, well, for my own grandparents that came, my grandpa came from England in 1913. And I think it was economics mostly. You know, you couldn't, and bigger families, you couldn't make a living there. So I think that's why he chose to come to Canada. And then he went back a few years later and married my grandma. But nobody else came. So I don't know whether it was economics but I have a feeling that was maybe it. Maybe for a better life.
I have 5 brothers in my place, and 4 of them went to Utah. 1 stayed in the UK, and of the 4 that went to Utah, 1 of them came back, allegedly with his possessions in a handkerchief tied on a bit of stick, although I think that's apocryphal. It was 1880s. And again, you know, why did they go, and why did he not like it when the other 3 did?
All the way to Utah in the United States at that point?
Wow.
1880. Wow, part of the migration out there. Wow.
So
you know, one of the one of the things that, as you've described this, I've realized, wouldn't it be cool if, as you know, before we even started recording, I talked a little bit about the map. So one of the wonders of the Society of One Place Studies is this idea of registering your one place study so that others who are interested in that area can find it and find you. And I know my family was from Yorkshire, and with the help of one of our members here, Jude Rhodes, I
yeah.
discovered she introduced me to my family line in Giggleswick, England,
Oh, right, okay.
Yorkshire. Little did I know there was such a place. But the idea of even just regions, I could know it's Yorkshire and this family line to Yorkshire and then go study Yorkshire. I could see whole study groups by regions and connections and how do you do's to learn more.
Mhm.
Wow. What a
Yeah.
wonderful resource. Luann,
And
you've gone
therefore,
off.
if there's a study registered for the place your ancestors came from, contact them. You know, they
Yeah.
may have information.
In fact, my sense is that they have toggled on their configuration specifically because they are open to be contacted. Is that yeah, okay, that's a big deal. That's a big deal.
Nobody's, you know, there's no compulsion to register. We do get a few who are professional historians who do it so they can put the badge on the website. But, you know, hey, it's
Hey,
fine.
that's fair. That's fair.
Well,
Luann, you took yourself off mute. Did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I just wanted to share the idea of a locality guide is generally something that I try to follow when I'm doing my genealogy, but I hadn't thought of the idea of taking it further to truly studying the place and how helpful that will be for my maternal line. My great grandmother moved here from Prussia.
okay.
Prussia. So that's
Big
helpful.
place, yeah.
And I have gotten a hint that has I don't know about a hint, it's on a document, but it's horribly spelled. And, you know, there's 3 possibilities in either Poland or Eastern Germany. But anyway, so I have a lot of work and patience for that. But the town that she lived in, outside of Chicago, is called Maywood, and the area is, you know, I've done basic like what documents are available, what can I find, but I love this idea of building up a study on that area, and the suburbs to Chicago are so often overlooked because, you know, it's a great city, it's a wonderful city, but they do take the focus for the county. So I really love the idea of doing it for her area where she lived for the rest of her life. It was probably 50 years that she lived there. And so I just think that that's a really helpful idea because there aren't that many things for her once she got married.
And it's a good way of building on the connected lives of ordinary people.
Yeah,
You know, a lot of it is the great and the good.
yeah.
And a couple of, you know, there's one of my favourite studies registered in a place in Devon in England is the Temple Mount Home for Inebriate Women that one of our committee members, Liz, has registered. She had an ancestor who was a resident there. And so she asked the questions, how did her relative come to be there? What happened when she was there? What happened when she left? And then she wanted to know, well, who else was in there with her and what were their stories? And built together the sort of past history and the forward history of these women who were unfortunate enough to need to end up in that place. And she's done a fantastic piece of work. It's been she's not written it up for publication, but some aspects of it have been taken and incorporated into various courses and, you know, from her presentations. So there are people.
Do you want to take us through this map?
Yeah, can do. You know, there
Yeah,
are people
please.
who formally publish the work. So Is this what you were referring to when you're saying about the interactive
Well,
map? Is that the one you meant?
this is specifically the United States, but show us the larger picture. And in
Okay, yeah.
particular, this to me is why we have so much work to do in the Americas, Canada and the United States.
Well, there you go.
But
as you can see, predominantly English-speaking world and predominantly United Kingdom. We have members all over the world, again, almost all English-speaking world. And we have studies in registered in all over the world. So, Luan, if you do register your place in Prussia, we can join you with somebody based in the US, actually, who's researching in the Czech Republic. We also have one in the Ukraine. There's one of our committee members lives in Salt Lake, is researching a place in Italy. And as I say, we have a sunken ship, and that was a bit creative as to exactly where we put that. But yep. And then so you click on a place. I'll take England, it's probably the largest. That will do it by county. And then if you go for any particular county, so Lancashire where I am, that is mine. That's the Spring Hill is the area that we've been talking about predominantly today. I started this when I realised that 5 generations of my family had lived in our house, well, what was then our house. And so it started as a house history and a combination of rabbit holes and sticking bits on, and it kind of grew. So like I say, it can be addictive. It is perfectly possible to do it using only free resources, and it's perfectly possible to do it as a distance. So as I said, we have a girl in Utah who is studying a place in Italy. Our first treasurer lives in Auckland, New Zealand, and is studying a place in Buckinghamshire. She's been once. She just can't nip down the road if she wants to check something, you know. So it's different depending on where you are, where your place is, and the resources that are available.
yeah.
So yeah, that's England, and then so Lebanon, for example, we've only got one in there. We only have one in the whole of Asia at the moment. So if anybody's got people in Asia, please do.
One of the things that I've been thinking about is we have, for example, really often lumped around languages, skill sets of different researchers based on language skills. So looking at the Americas and both Canada and the United States as English-speaking countries, large groups have come from Scandinavian countries, for example, the German-speaking countries. My own side, it was Switzerland, but it was a German-speaking Switzerland with many other ancestors behind that, and Prussia with you, and so on. I don't speak German. It's a little scary to me, but we have many members who have actually expressed a specific focus in Germany. And I haven't really thought of ways to tailor groups around that, because frankly, there are some wonderful societies that are already doing that. But ways to weave these things in is something that I am thinking about, and all of you are very welcome to toss me ideas, suggestions. Volunteering is always an opportunity. And ways to have that work. You, Janet, have been so generous with your time, and your entire community has just had a pay it forward ethos across everything you do, which I truly appreciate. Actually, why don't you go ahead and take down the slides here so we can just see each other. There you go. And in social media, your team is always out there giving a rah-rah to anything, which I truly appreciate. But it sets a tone. It sets a tone, and expectation, and a generosity and trust and kindness that I think is just so important to collaborating and working together and supporting each other as we go forward. So I'm especially excited about One Place Studies, One Community Studies, as something that might inspire each other. You talk about a sunken ship here in the United States. There is a very famous story about the Clotilda, one of the last slave ships that was brought to the United States actually after the laws passed and changed. And then there's the whole history behind it. That already has, documentaries about it and websites and whatnot. But there are a lot of local stories, I'm sure, that individuals can make a difference on in the research that they do. And I want to thank you, Janet, for this wonderful, wonderful two-part series. In answer to the question I asked in like September, how might we work together after our participation in the All About That Place? Now that we've learned that there will not be an All About That Place series quite like that this calendar year, I'm open to suggestions and eager to ways that we might help move things along and encourage people. So many of you, several of you I noticed were new, and I'm delighted to have you and welcome you into our little community and ways we might do something, right?
Well, thank you for the invitation, and you're welcome. And I'm certainly happy to keep working with you. It's been a pleasure.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you all for participating. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording now, but you're welcome to stay on.